and thanks to all of you for showing up. So since it's pretty late, I would like to do something very entertaining here and start with a short video of Ayn Rand.
All right.
And now what is self-sacrifice?
Yes, what is self-sacrifice? You say that you do not like the altruism by which we live. You like a certain kind of Ayn Randist selfishness.
I would say that I don't like is too weak a word. I consider it evil. And self-sacrifice is the precept that man needs to serve others in order to justify his existence, that his moral duty is to serve others. That is what most people believe today.
Well, yes, we're taught to feel concerned for our fellow man, to feel responsible for his welfare, to feel that we are, as religious people might put it, children under God and responsible one for the other. Now, why do you rebel? What's wrong with this philosophy?
But that is what, in fact, makes man a sacrificial animal, that man must work for others, concern himself with others, or be responsible for them. That is the role of a sacrificial object. I say that man is entitled to his own happiness and that he must achieve it himself, but that he cannot demand that others give up their lives to make him happy. And nor should he wish to sacrifice himself for the happiness of others. I hold that man should have self-esteem.
And cannot man have self-esteem if he loves his fellow man? What's wrong with loving your fellow man? Christ, every important moral leader in man's history, has taught us that we should love one another. Why, then, is this kind of love, in your mind, immoral?
It is immoral if it is a love placed above oneself. It is more than immoral, it's impossible. Because when you are asked to love everybody indiscriminately, that is, to love people without any standard, to love them regardless of the fact of whether they have any value or virtue, you are asked to love nobody.
But in a sense, in your book, you talk about love as if it were a business deal of some kind. Isn't the essence of love that it is above self-interest?
Well, let me make it concrete for you. What would it mean to have love above self-interest? It would mean, for instance, that a husband would tell his wife, if he were moral, according to the conventional morality, that I am marrying you just for your own sake. I have no personal interest in it, but I am so unselfish that I am marrying you only for your own good.
Well, should husbands and wives
would
tally
any
up?
woman like that?
Should husbands and wives, tally up at the end of the day and say, well, now, wait a minute. I love her if she's done enough for me today, or she loves me if I have properly performed my functions?
No, you misunderstood me. That is not how love should be treated. I agree with you that it should be treated like a business deal, but every business has to have its own terms and its own kind of currency. And in love, the currency is virtue. You love people not for what you do for them or what they do for you. You love them for the values, the virtues which they have achieved in their own character. You don't love causelessly. You don't love everybody indiscriminately. You love only those who deserve it.
And then if a man is weak or a woman is weak, then he is beyond love?
He certainly does not deserve it. He certainly is beyond. He can always correct it. Man has free will. If a man wants love, he should correct his weaknesses or his flaws, and he may deserve it. But he cannot expect the unearned, neither in love nor in money, neither in matter nor spirit.
You have lived in our world, and you recognize the fallibility of human beings. There are very few of us, then, in this world, by your standards, who are worthy of love.
Unfortunately, yes, very few. But it is open to everybody to make themselves worthy of it, and that is all that my morality offers them.
If they will
a way to make themselves worthy of love, although that's not the primary motive.
So this was Ayn Rand on her very first TV appearance in 1959. And I watched some of you, and I think if you listen to this today, maybe not here where a lot of objectivists, but if you screen that somewhere, most people will be shocked, maybe also confused, because Rand is very harsh here. Now, in order to fully understand how controversial this must have been when Rand said it in 1959, we need to have a look and ask ourselves, in what era, in what period were we in? And I think broadly speaking, we can say that the first half of the 20th century was the period of modernism. So people tried to make sense of the world, they tried to understand the world, and they wanted to reach a consensus about what to do now, because they were rebelling against old forms, most importantly classicism, and they wanted to find order. But they couldn't reach a consensus. Ezra Pound famously said, make it new. So they were rebelling, but they did not ultimately find a solution to the problems they had identified. And then all structures very much broke down with World War II, and then we entered the period of postmodernism. If you want to find out more, of course, I would like to recommend Stephen Hicks' brilliant book, Explaining Postmodernism. But basically the idea which came up in the end of the 40s were, we cannot know anything about reality, we cannot gain any knowledge, we cannot be sure of anything. And now Rand gives this interview again in 1959. And I think the only two things that Americans could agree upon were A, that there is a prime mover, that there is a God which created the world, and second, that the Christian morality, the idea of self-sacrifice is right, and that it's virtuous that we sacrifice ourselves for others. And of course, this also led to the Christian idea of love, that love consists in self-sacrifice. And Rand goes on stage and says the following, and again, here's what I consider the key quote from the excerpt I just showed you. So every business has to have its own terms and its own kind of currency, and in love, the currency is virtue. You love people not for what you do for them or what they do for you. You love them for the values and the virtues which they have achieved in their own character. You don't love causelessly. You don't love everybody indiscriminately. You love only those who deserve it. So Rand's idea here is that love is not selfless, but selfish, and that love is something which has to be earned and cannot be given freely. And this precisely is the idea which I would like to defend today. All right, so welcome to my talk, Values and Virtues as Spiritual Currencies, how to settle and enjoy moral transactions on the marketplace for love and friendship. So I have divided my talk into 3 parts. And in the first part, I would like to talk about egoistic love, and I will argue that values and virtues are prerequisites for egoistic love. So I will argue that we need to first find out what our own values and virtues are, and we need to find them embodied in another person. And in the second part of my presentation, I would then like to have a look at how this virtuous egoistic love looks like. So I would like to get some misconceptions out of the way, and I will argue that selfish love, properly identified and understood, is neither instrumental nor a zero-sum game. I will come to define those terms, but as you can see, those are already economic terms which I'm applying to love. And in the last part of my lecture, I would then like to start developing an economic approach to love. So we will talk about the danger of risk, but also about the potential of trade, spiritual trade in this case, and we will also model love according to the model of supply and demand. So that's the plan for today. Welcome to the first section, the self and its mirror, values and virtues as prerequisites for egoistic love. So I would like to start this talk by showing you a quotation which is probably one of the most heavily quoted from Rand, but also I think one of the most heavily misunderstood. Halfway through the Fountainhead, the protagonist Howard Roark utters the following line, quote, "To say I love you, one must know first how to say the I," end quote. And in the first part of this lecture, I would like to have a look at the sentence. And in order to fully understand the sentence, I argue that we need to understand movement, and I think the only correct theory of movement was presented by Aristotle. So I will go back all the way to Aristotle, explain Aristotle's theory of motion, and then I will apply it to this sentence. So Aristotle comes up with a theory of motion in book 8, the last book of the physics. And the first thing he points out is, quote, "All things that are in motion will be moved by something," end quote. So Aristotle differentiates between, on the one hand, inanimate matter, and on the other hand, conscious entities. So inanimate matter, for instance, might be a table or a chair, and Aristotle argues that those things which are consisting of inanimate matter cannot move themselves. They can only be moved if someone else comes around and moves them from the outside, an external mover, because they have no consciousness, they have no soul. But it is different with conscious entities. Conscious entities, for instance, animals, higher animals, but also men, of course, can initiate movement on their own. They can project a purpose into the future, and teleologically, they can be moved by that purpose. So it's not necessary that an external mover comes around. We can move ourselves. Now, Aristotle says that ultimately there must be one first unmoved mover. The idea is as follows. Let us say that we have an architect, Howard Roark, for instance. It would be ridiculous to say that he is fully self-moved. Howard Roark got inspired by another architect in the novel, Henry Cameron. But that architect was again moved by another person, by another architect, and so on and so forth. And there cannot be such an infinite line of movers. So Aristotle writes, there must be some first mover that is not moved by another, for it is impossible for a series of movers, which are themselves moved by another, to go on to infinity, for there is no first member of an infinite series, end quote. So in short, Aristotle argues there cannot be an infinite series, but at the same time, every mover is himself moved. So Aristotle has a problem here, and he solves it in the following way. He says the first mover has two parts, a moved part and an unmoved part. I will read out a passage, then I will give you two examples. So he writes, of the whole first mover, one part will cause motion while remaining unmoved. That's the unmoved mover we're looking for. And one part will be moved, the moved mover. For only in this way will it be possible for something to be self-moved, end quote. So I will apply this theory in a sentence, in a second, to our sentence, I love you. But first I will give you a simpler example. I will move the table. So let us say that over there a light bulb is no longer working and I'm not tall enough to get there. So I decide that I want to move the table over there in order to fix the light bulb. So let's have a look at the sentence, I will move the table. Very simple sentence. So we have three different things here in this sentence. So first we have the table. The table, again, is an inanimate object. It cannot move itself. It can only be moved if there is movement. So when we look at the sentence, we have the verb will move. So the table, the moved entity, is only moved because there is movement. Now here Aristotle adds something terribly important, because on the Platonic view, there can be movement in itself in the universe. Movement is an intrinsic part of the universe. Aristotle disagrees. He says there cannot be movement without the mover, without the I. So ultimately, in this case, something is moved. This is the table. Why? Because there is an act of movement. But the act of movement does not exist in and for itself. It only exists because there is the mover, the I, which does the moving. So in such a case, if I move the table over there, I'm in movement. So what is the unmoved mover? It's my aim, my purpose to move the table. That is constant during this entire process. So my aim, my purpose, which is to move the table, my unmoved mover, moves me, the mover, to move the table. That would be an example of the Aristotelian theory, physical movement. So let's have a look at the second example, which I want to focus on, spiritual movement. And whenever I say spiritual in this entire talk, I don't mean anything mystical, like Rand, I mean in regard to consciousness rather than in regard to body. So again, we have the sentence, I love you, with three different particles. So first, we have the you, which is the object. Just as in the last sentence, we had the table as the object. So the you is the object, the you is the moved particle here. What is the you moved by? It's moved by the act of love. But just as there can be no movement without a mover in the universe, there can be no love without a lover. So you first need to have a stable I. So in this case, the you is moved. What is the other moved by? By the act of love. But the act of love can only exist if you have a stable I which expresses this love. And again, what is my unmoved mover? If I want to express my love to my girlfriend by reaching to her and kissing her, I'm in movement. So the unmoved mover is my aim, it's my purpose, which is to express my love. And that moves me, the mover, to do that, to express my love. Now there is a difference between those two examples. In the table example, if I move the table over there, the table cannot move me back because the table is an inanimate entity. It cannot move itself. So once I have moved the table over there, that's the act of movement and it's over. But in this case, why are we saying the sentence, I love you? Well, ideally, and if we're not a sociopath, we want to have the other person tell us, I love you too. So ultimately, if you say that sentence, I love you, what we are hoping for is that the you will reciprocate that love and tell us, I love you too. So here we are dealing with two consciousnesses getting together, not consciousness versus inanimate matter. And this is the point I would like to focus on, two consciousnesses uniting. So I have two hypotheses here, which I will then explain. So in order for love to be genuine and worthwhile, I hold two conditions must be fulfilled. A, the lover, the I, needs to represent values and virtues. And B, the beloved, the other, the you, needs to represent values and virtues. And Rand focuses on both points. So for instance, in the objectivist ethics, she talks about the lover. And she writes, quote, to love is to value. Only a rationally selfish man, a man of self-esteem, is capable of love, because he is the only man capable of holding firm, consistent, uncompromising, unbetrayed values. The man who does not value himself cannot value anything or anyone, end quote. So what is important here, I think, is that Rand talks about a man who's holding firm, consistent, uncompromising, unbetrayed values. This is a man who has a stable eye. He knows who he is and what he is looking for. So this is why he's the only man capable of love. But he now needs to find those virtues and values which he embodies, embodied in another person. In Atlas Shrugged, Rand writes, as to the beloved, quote, "To love a thing is to know and love its nature," end quote. So in other words, when we meet other people, we first need to get information. We need to know who they are. Are they representing values and virtues, or are they representing vices? And then we need to act. This is what the virtue of justice demands. If there are good people who contribute to our happiness, we should want them in our own lives. If there are bad, evil people who are only representing vices, we should make sure that we don't deal with them, if possible. So we first need to understand the other, and then if they represent values and virtues, we should love them on the objectivist view. So Leonard Peikoff in OPA, he puts both into consideration, the lover and the beloved, and he writes, quote, "The attainment of love requires a proper course of thought and action. It requires that a person define and validate the specific values of character and a hierarchy that he regards as important to himself, personally." This would be the self. It requires that he recognizes these values when he encounters them, which means that he learned to identify objectively the traits possessed by others, that's the other, the you, and by himself, end quote. Only in this case can we have a union. So both the lover and the beloved need to present values, moral values, virtues. Now the point here is, it is not enough to find any values or virtues in another person, I hold, because ultimately what we are looking for are people who share our values, and there's a lot of optionality involved here. So what we need to add is ultimately, and this is my key thesis for the first part, egoistic love is mirroring. So I come up with that term, I will explain in a moment what I mean by that. But when we find another person, we need to see that that person mirrors our own values and virtues. Now Rand in her nonfiction, she never used the word mirroring. The one word she always used was embodiment. We find the values and virtues we uphold embodied in another person. So for instance, in her speech of Living Death, she said, quote, "Romantic love in the full sense of the term is an emotion possible only to the man or woman of unbreached self-esteem." That's the I, we talked about that. But now she adds, "It is his response to his own highest values in the person of another, an integrated response of mind and body, of love and sexual desire," end quote. So this, Rand holds, is what romantic love is about. Now, as I said before, I used that word mirroring, but I didn't find it in Rand's nonfiction. However, Tara Smith, objectivist philosopher from Texas, she wrote a book on the 7 cardinal objectivist virtues, and she keeps talking about reflection or reflecting. So she writes, for instance, loving another person insofar as it reflects valuing is a thoroughly self-interested proposition, end quote. Tara Smith doesn't use the word mirror, but reflection or reflecting, but ultimately that is precisely what a mirror does. It reflects. So I think that Tara Smith has the same idea here, which I have. So now I would like to go back to the original sentence from the Fountainhead. And this is the entire passus in which that sentence comes up, and I would like to have a look at the entire excerpt here now. So halfway through the novel, Howard Roark expresses his love for his love interest, Dominique. And he says, quote, "I love you, Dominique, as selfishly as the fact that I exist, as selfishly as my lungs breathe air. I breathe for my own necessity, for the fuel of my body, for my survival. I've given you not my sacrifice or my pity, but my ego and my naked need. This is the only way you can wish to be loved. This is the only way I can want you to love me. To say I love you, one must know first how to say the I," end quote. So what is interesting in that passage is, first and foremost, we see that Howard Roark clearly knows who he is. He has a stable eye. And he's interested in Dominique. He loves her. But if you read the novel, you will know this is halfway through the novel, and they are not starting a relationship here. And what is the case for that? Well, Howard Roark is very optimistic about the future. He has a very benevolent sense of life. But at this point in the novel, Dominique is completely pessimistic. She's convinced that all the great things in life cannot be achieved anyway, and this is why we are not having mirroring at this point. It happens later in the novel. But at this point, they do not share the same values and virtues, because Dominique is much more pessimistic than Howard Roark. However, there are other interesting instances in Rand's novels, so I would like to have a look just at 2 of them. So I would like to go all the way back to Real Living, which was Rand's first novel, published in 1936. And it's a love story of Kira and Leo. They are in the Soviet Union, and they want to escape together. So they hold this as their common value, that they want to escape Soviet Russia, and they want to live a human life elsewhere. Now, the first quotation I have here is not from somewhere in the novel. This is from the first time that Kira and Leo meet. So it's not only Rand's first love story, but it's the first time Rand's first lovers come together. And Rand writes, quote, her, Kira's face, was a mirror for the beauty of his, Leo's, end quote. So here we see how important mirroring was. They see each other, and it would be ridiculous to argue they just consider themselves or each other physically attractive. No, here we are seeing two souls uniting. They see that they share the same vision, so they can mirror. However, if you have read the book, you will know that Kira stays spiritually intact until the very end. Leo, in sharp contrast, he deteriorates. He becomes a gambler, a playboy, a drunk, and ultimately, mirroring no longer works because Leo has changed his views and he's no longer compatible with Kira. So ultimately, Rand writes, quote, he, Leo, looked into her, Kira's, flaming eyes, with eyes that were like mirrors, which could not reflect a flame any longer. Why bother, he asked, end quote. So when we have found our mirror, it's not enough that we just don't do anything. We need to consistently practice the values and virtues, which we know we share with our partner, in order to have a lasting relationship. One more example about the use of mirror. So the last quotation I have here is from Atlas Shrugged. And this happens immediately after Dagny for the first time sleeps with John Galt. And Dagny feels proud, quote, that it should be she whom John Galt has chosen as his mirror, that it should be her body which was now giving him the sum of his existence as his body was giving him the sum of hers, end quote. So as you can see when it comes to this collection of quotations, that idea of mirroring in love relationship comes up in all of Rand's fiction very much. Now, one more side note before we come to the second part of the presentation. If you read secondary literature on Aristotle, a lot of people, Aristotle scholars, argue that Aristotle in the Ethics used that idea of mirroring, that he used that word. So this is wrong. I ran through the Nicomachean Ethics, and he talks about friendship especially in the last two books, not the last two books, sorry, in books 8 and 9. And he continuously talks about your friend, your best friend, as an allos autos or an heteros autos, which means a second self or another self. Now, this is the idea Aristotle uses. I think it's terribly close to the idea I am presenting here, but he never used the word mirror either. So the point is, what you need to do, I think, is you need to first mirror, you need to see the other, you need to see your own values reflected in the other, and then you start traveling in the same direction, looking at the same purpose and achieving values together. Rand writes, quote, lovers and friends can be only travelers you choose to share your journey and must be travelers going on their own power in the same directions, end quote. So two independent minds identifying the same things as values, working together to achieve them. So key takeaway for the first part, quotation by Tara Smith, quote, the egoist will love another person because that person is valuable to him, that's the self, and because of who that person is, that's the other. The latter explains the former, it explains why the egoist values him in particular, end quote. So now I would like to have a look at what virtuous love, properly speaking, looks like. And again, I would like to get two misconceptions out of the way here. So first, the idea that virtuous love, egoistic love, is instrumental, that one person necessarily uses the other. And second, the idea that love is a zero-sum game. So what do I mean by that? Probably most of you know that, but some of you might not be economists. So there are two theories, competing theories in economic thought, or rather one theory and one fallacy. On the one hand, the positive sum game theory, which means that if we trade, then we can both win. So it's not true that one of us must lose. And on the other hand, the zero-sum game theory, or zero-sum game fallacy, which is the Marxist theory. The idea that if we trade, one person, usually the worker, must lose at the expense of another, usually the entrepreneur, the businessman. So I will get those ideas out of the way. But first, one more misconception. So up to now, I've mostly talked about love. Now I'm talking about friendship. So some of you might now think that this might be topics for two talks and that I cannot mix love and friendship here. I think we can, because we're dealing with the same phenomenon here. When you're talking about love or friendship, this is not a difference in kind, but a difference in degree. So for instance, in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, Rand writes the following, quote, "Let us answer the question, can you measure love? The concept love is formed by isolating two or more instances of appropriate psychological process, then retaining its distinguishing characteristics, an emotion proceeding from the evaluation of an existent as a positive value and as a source of pleasure, and omitting the object and the measurements of the process's intensity," end quote. We can love different things. We can love an event, and I hope if you go home, you all love this event and you had a great time. You might love a person. You might love your pet. You might love only one attribute of a person. Or you might love a statue or a book. But depending on what you love, the intensity will be different, but we're dealing with the same phenomenon. So if you have such a barometer, for instance, let us say that there is an event. You meet with your friends and you have a dinner at a restaurant, and you really say, I really love that dinner. You would probably be here in the very green phase, in the very beginning, because it was just a simple get-together with your friends. Well, if you talk about, let us say, a book or a statue, something you have at home, this is much more lasting than a one-time encounter. So probably you will be in the third part here, in the lighter green phase, I would say. How about if you have a pet? I think a pet must mean more to you than your statue, because ultimately it's also a living conscious being rather than the statue, which is inanimate. So probably you will be there in the yellow part. How about friendship? Well, probably you're there where the barometer is now, in the orange zone. If it's your best friend, you should feel more for that person than for a book, or let us say, even for a pet. But the point here is when we're coming to the very red phase in the very end, I think this is the part of this barometer which is exclusively for romantic love. So as you can see, we love different things, but ultimately it's the same idea, just the intensity varies. So Aristotle differentiates three forms of friendship, and I would like to have a look at them, and I think we can also translate them into the realm of love. So first he talks about the two imperfect forms of friendship, which would be friendship of utility and friendship of pleasure. So friendship of utility would be the idea that, for instance, I am a capitalist, I think that's pretty clear, and let us say that I'm traveling and somewhere in Latin America I find a capitalist organization. But we have huge epistemological differences because they're all, let us say, Hayekians, and I am not. I could still work with those people. We could work together for one purpose, to promote liberty, and then maybe we all do something else. So that might be friendship of utility. And I think there's nothing immoral about that. But if you translate it into the realm of love, it would be different. Here we would have the example, for instance, of, let us say, 60-year-old white guy flying to Thailand and buying a 20-year-old girlfriend. So here we have an exchange of utility, sex as against money, and I think much more immoral than the friendship part. Now what about the second imperfect form of friendship? Friendship of pleasure. Maybe the ones here who are younger still experienced it. You are 18, you are coming from high school. So you have people who might not share all your values and virtues, but you want to go out partying and dancing. So you just do that for some time. In a sexual encounter, it would probably be something like Tinder today. That you meet up with someone, you don't really care what values they have, but you consider them, I don't know, handsome or gorgeous, so you just hook up with them. That would be the idea here. Aristotle says that both those forms, the friendship of utility and the friendship of pleasure, are not lasting. Why? He writes, quote, "Those who love because of utility love because of what is good for themselves, and those who love because of pleasure do so because of what is pleasant to themselves, and not because of who the loved person is, but insofar as he is useful or pleasant," end quote. So on these two forms of friendship, or love, or pseudo-love, if you want to put it that way, you don't take the other into consideration. You're only focused on the self. It's different with the perfect form of friendship. With the perfect form of friendship, it comes to a union because you know that the other person shares your values. Aristotle writes, perfect friendship is the friendship of men who are good and alike in virtue, who have the same kind of virtue. For these wish well alike to each other qua good, because they are good, and they are good in themselves. Now those who wish well to their friends for their sake are most truly friends, for they do this by reason of own nature, because they want to do it, because they know that the other person is important. And not incidentally, therefore their friendship lasts as long as they are good, and goodness is an enduring thing, end quote. So this is also the Aristotelian idea, that on the perfect form of friendship, Rand would say of love, that you find your values and virtues mirrored in the other. This has some implications when we think about it, because if you take selfishness as it is traditionally misrepresented, as selfishness meaning ruling over other people, exploiting other people, manipulating other people, you would end up with a toxic relationship. You would end up with a relationship in which one person abuses the other person. But if we understand that this is not the correct form, but a misconception of selfishness, we come up with a different form of selfish love. Rand pointed out, quote, the exact meaning and dictionary definition of the word selfishness is concern with one's own interests, end quote. So as you see, there is nothing in this definition which means exploiting other people or using them for their own benefit. No, this is just being concerned with yourself, figuring out which values and virtues are important to yourself. And if you find two people, if you find one partner who shares your values and virtues and who is independently minded, then ultimately you have a very good relationship, although both are being selfish about it. Rand wrote, one falls in love with the embodiment of the values that formed a person's character, which are reflected in his widest goals or smallest gestures, which create the style of his soul, the individual style of a unique, unrepeatable, irreplaceable consciousness, end quote. So the point is, if you're bringing that all together, we should see now, I think, that selfish love, properly defined, is not instrumental, because it is about the welfare of the other. If someone else is important to you selfishly, you should better make sure that they are feeling well with you, because otherwise you will not be with them for very long. Rand wrote, the practical implementation of friendship, affection, and love, so note how he or she also puts together in one package love and friendship, consists of incorporating the welfare, the rational welfare of the person involved into one's own hierarchy of values, then acting accordingly, end quote. And maybe we have made that experience. If you had a partner, probably you hurt your partner at one point. Not because you wanted to, but maybe you made a mistake, or you said something which you later realized wasn't the perfect thing to say, and you might have hurt your partner. And maybe you have made experience that you felt hurt yourself. And if you're interested in your own rational self-interest, you shouldn't do that, because you shouldn't want to hurt yourself. So you better make sure that your partner is happy with you. Look at how this Rand describes Howard Roark in her journals. She wrote, quote, when he likes a man, he likes him for that man's own sake, not for what he, Roark, can get from that man, end quote. So there is no instrumentality involved whatsoever if you properly define selfishness and selfish love. Tara Smith wrote, the contention that the egoist, because he is primarily committed to his own well-being, cannot value anything other than that, fails to understand Rand's view of the relationship between values and life. The numerous values that sustain a person's life could seem merely instrumental only if one accepted an artificial separation between life and values. In fact, in seeking to promote his own life, what the egoist seeks is a world of values, end quote. So since love is not instrumental, it follows that love is also not a zero-sum game. So what is the zero-sum game theory? Again, in economic terms, it means that we have a fixed pie in the economy. There is a certain amount of wealth which has already been created, and now it's only a question of distribution. So consequently, here, for instance, on that picture, you see someone taking out roughly 25%. So on the Marxian view, we have that fixed pie, and if one businessman takes out 25%, we are only left with 75, which we can distribute among all the other members of society. Now, this again is a fallacy. Quite the opposite is true. If you let the businessmen be free, if you let them be free to produce, then ultimately that cake will become bigger and bigger, and there will be much more wealth in the economy. And the same is true of love. It would be ridiculous to say something like, I showed affection to one person, so now 20% of my affection are gone, I only have 80% left. So quite the opposite. If we want to have a benevolent society, we should have more lovers, and we should show them by example what it means to be a benevolent person. So Rand wrote, like any other value, love is not a static quantity, a fixed pie to be divided, but an unlimited response to be earned. The love for one friend is not a threat to the love for another, and neither is the love for the various members of one's family, assuming they have earned it, end quote. So that was the second part, to get some misconceptions out of the way. And now, last but not least, I would like to start developing an economic approach to love and have some look at risk and trade. So here, this is very interesting, because ultimately, if you look at the market, what we are doing these days is we are trading with coins or bills. So one person brings products to the market, and usually we pay him with coins. But ultimately, this has not always been the case, because originally we had a barter society. So we didn't have any coins or bills, which are just, at least in a good society, in an ideal society, placeholders for goods which have already been produced. So originally people went to the market and they all bought their products there. They exchanged products for products. And in the same way, on the marketplace for love and friendship, we are exchanging values and virtues, and this is how it should be. So Leonard Peacock wrote, quote, "The objectivist does not say I value only myself." He says, if you are a certain kind of person, a person who upholds values, you become thereby a value to me in the furtherance of my own life and happiness, end quote. And we only need to have a look at Rand's novels, and we see that this idea comes up over and over again. I will not read out all the quotations. You can have a look at them later. The slides will be shared with you. But just as at the first one here, from Atlas Shrugged, second one on the slide, this is from her idea of justice. And she writes, quote, "Your moral appraisal is to coin paying men for their virtues or vices, and this payment demands of you as scrupulous an honor as you bring to financial transactions," end quote. Later in Atlas Shrugged, she talks about love as the emotional price which one man pays for the joy he receives from the virtues of another. And in the objectivist ethics, for instance, to give you an example from the non-fiction, she talks about love as a spiritual payment. So that terminology comes up over and over again. Now the point here is there is risk involved, because whenever we offer something, there is risk. Let us focus again on the market first. If I am a businessman, there is a risk that other people might not buy my product. Again, there are two consciousnesses we need to focus on here. A, my own consciousness as a producer, and B, the consciousnesses of all of my audience who might or might not buy my product. Now, I can have the best product in the world, which philosophically, objectively speaking, is very helpful to a lot of people. But if I live in an irrational society, people might nevertheless not buy my product. This is always the danger, the risk involved. So we cannot control all the other people, we cannot control the market. What we can control, however, is our own product. We better make sure that our own product is good. Because if I'm a businessman and I promise that I invent a pill, I bring it to the market, and it will make all of you healthier, better looking, and so on and so forth, but it kills you all within 24 hours, I will go to prison, rightly so. So I better make sure that my product is good. And in the same way, if I go to the marketplace of friendship, of love, I don't know whether I will find my perfect match tomorrow or the day after. But I can make sure that I am a good person, that I have a good character, and that I bring something valuable which other people can see in me. Only in this case do I have the chance for love. But what is more important probably, whenever there's risk, there's also opportunity. So if I go to the marketplace for love and friendship, if I want to find good people or a lover, then while there's risk, there's also opportunity. Because if I don't risk it, if I'm just sitting at home and say that the world is a bad place, I will never find any friends. So we should take that risk. Tara Smith writes, "Given that human beings are not omniscient about the future or able to control other people's actions, the rational pursuit of one's interests demands that a person make investments of various sorts. It is in the nature of investments that their ultimate fruit is not known in advance. Friendship is one such investment, and romantic love. Not every possible friendship is worth pursuing. Because of the tremendous value that good friendships can offer, however, some of them are. The rational egoist will realize that some risks are worth taking because they are in his interest." End quote. So now you may wonder, I am saying you should build your own character. You should be a valuable, virtuous person. Maybe you might wonder, can I not just fake it? I could just go to the market and pretend that I have values and virtues, which I don't possess. Well, one character in Atlas Shrugged, James Taggart, he tries precisely that. He wants to fake virtues and values, and his wife, Cheryl, finds out that he doesn't have any. But nevertheless, James wants to be seen as a virtuous man. So here's what he has to say to Cheryl. Quote, "To be loved for, so you think that love is a matter of mathematics, of exchange, of weighing and measuring, like a pound of butter on a grocery counter. I don't want to be loved for anything. I want to be loved for myself, not for anything I do or have or say or think. For myself, not for my body or mind or words or works or actions." And Cheryl then answers, "But then what is yourself?" So you see, this is the problem. In the long run, it can't work. So one last point before I open it up for questions. So I think that we really need to model love. And I think what we need to reach here is equilibrium. So what you can see here is, of course, the economic model of supply and demand. And what we want to have on the market is we want to have quantity demanded equaling quantity supplied. So the idea then would be equilibrium, because if we don't have that, we have a problem. If we have quantity supplied exceeding quantity demanded, then we have a surplus. We have produced too much in a certain aspect, which is bad because we are not exploiting the resources to their maximal capacity, because we are producing too much in one line of the economy, and the resources could be better used in another, so we're having a surplus. On the other hand, if quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, then we have a shortage, which is also problematic. So none of that can work, and I think the same needs to apply for love. We should also have equilibrium there. Let us have a look at a quote from Leonard Peikoff. I will read out half of it, then explain it, and then do the same with the second half. So Peikoff writes, "To give a person less than he deserves, judging by one's own hierarchy, is to betray one's values." So on the other hand, we are creating a shortage. We are seeing that another person is important to us, for instance, our best friend, but we are not giving them enough time. We are not dedicating enough of our own time to them, and this is problematic because ultimately the other person will leave us because we are not giving them what they deserve. On the other hand, just as a surplus, a shortage is also problematic. Both of them are problematic. Peikoff writes, "To give him more," that would be the surplus, "is to divert resources to a recipient who is unworthy of them by one's own definition, and thus again to sacrifice one's own values." End quote. If I pretend that my girlfriend is better than she is, that she has virtues, which in fact she doesn't have, then I am just deluding myself, and ultimately this must collapse because I'm just promoting evil. I'm showing her she's a good case, although she is not, so ultimately this must also fail. So in short, Peikoff writes, "A man must deserve what he seeks from others. He can deserve it only by earning it, only by creating the values of character that make his relationship with others a trade." End quote. And I think Leonard Peikoff made here a fair trade in which both persons represent values and virtues and can trade them with one another. So one more thing, in the interview I showed you in the beginning, Rand said, people should not get together at the end of the day and say, "You have done this for me, I have done that for you, let's do a list and let's see we have equilibrium." No. Because again, remember, the key virtue according to objectivism is rationality, which also means to think in the long run. So we need to have equilibrium in the long run. It's perfectly compatible, for instance, if my partner is depressed and I help him or her for 1 week, and I give more than I am taking. But on the other hand, maybe I am depressed a few weeks later, and then my partner might do more for me. So we need to focus on equilibrium in the long run. Smith writes, "The self-interested character of a relationship is compatible with periods of more giving than getting. What is important is the overall benefit of the friendship, which can only be measured from a long-range, all things considered perspective." End quote. So to end with, I have one more quotation because I showed you the terrible example of James Taggart. And as some of you know, I always end with a good note. So I would like to read out to you what Hank Rearden, one of the heroes of Atlas Shrugged, has to say to Dagny Taggart, the heroine, and how they define love. He says, "I love you as the same value, as the same expression, with the same pride and the same meaning as I love my work, my mills, my metal, my house at a my hours at a desk, at a furnace, in a laboratory, in an ore mine, as I love my ability to work, as I love the act of sight and knowledge, as I love the action of my body when it solves a chemical equation or grasps a sunrise, as I love the things I've made and the things I felt, as my product, as my choice, as the shape of my world, as my best mirror, as that which makes all the rest of it possible, as my power to live." End quote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. All right, if we want to line up behind me, line up behind Carly, we will do a few questions. All right, let's start here with Cesar.
Thank you, Martin, for the lecture. So I'm interested in how this philosophy could apply to other types of relationship, more beyond romantic or friendship relationship. For example, in terms of family, from an objectivist perspective, how does this principle of egoistic love apply to these family ties when usually you have like an unconditional or inherited love for other person?
Well, I give you first my view, and then I will say something. Rand gave an interview in 1980, which is not very well known, when she discussed with Newman, and she discusses precisely that point. So on my view, exactly the same principles which I have talked about apply here. You shouldn't love your family unconditionally. If they are bad people, then why should you do that? It would be ridiculous if you have, for instance, a woman who was sexually abused by her uncle for 15 years to say that woman should love her uncle just because he's her uncle. So I think the same applies. Those people need to form their own characters. If they're bad people, they need to be rejected. Now, on my view, that goes for everyone in your family. Rand, interestingly, had a slightly different view. In 1980, she gave that interview to Newman, and she's asked about duty. And she says she doesn't accept the term duty, as Rob Trzynski pointed out earlier today. But she says if the term duty makes any sense, it only makes sense when you say duty towards your parents, because they play a very special role. Without them, you would not be here on Earth. And this is why, if they're not like really terrible people, then you should respect them, and they deserve some due for what they have done. Now, I think I would go slightly different there. I would say if they have really helped you early in your career, financing your studies or whatsoever, and if they have just been good parents who gave you chances, I think you should respect them, even if you don't agree with them on everything. But if they have really been very terrible people, I think you should cut ties altogether and reject them.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask your perspective on a situation that is probably pretty common. Imagine if there's a member of your family or a friend, or even yourself, who may be in not the best part of life, someone who is not exemplifying any good values or virtues, someone who, according to Ayn Rand, is not deserving of love. And yet, and even in the long run, years may be in this position. Oftentimes, the only thing that's able to really bring that person out of that situation is by showing that person love. And in that, they are redeemed. And if you were to, and then let's say they died, like right after that. So there's no long-term, they give back to you, reach equilibrium. Is that morally wrong to continue to show that person love, although they are undeserving, if that is precisely what might end up curing them of whatever they may be in?
Thanks, very good question. Yes, utterly immoral. And I will explain why. Now, the point is, first and foremost, if someone is so evil, why should you be with that person in the first place? If, as you say, they really have no virtues or values whatsoever, why should you be with that person in the first place? But let's then take a different example. Let us say they were good people in the past, but they have changed their character, which unfortunately we see. Let us say they are completely black then, and they have no virtues or values whatsoever. First of all, I don't accept the notion of duty, so I don't think that you have a duty to help those people. If you want to do it, fine, but I consider it immoral because you're promoting evil. What you are suggesting is those people are somehow producing any value, and you have to remember, every second or every minute you spend with those people is 1 second or 1 minute less you can spend with people who are actually deserving and to contribute to your happiness. Now, the second point is, if someone is really that evil, then should they be forgiven? I would say no. And it opens all kinds of doors, because basically, if that is the prevalent notion, that ultimately everyone should be forgiven, then Hitler can walk around, kill 6 million Jews, and in the last second he says, oh, I'm sorry for it, and then he's redeemed. This is precisely the problem with this theory.
Hello. I'm trying to wrap my mind around this economic model of love. I understand the transactional aspect of it, and I understand that we don't mean transactional in the sense of deriving direct utility, but more that you're getting something out of who the other person is, what their values are, what their virtue is. The virtues are they're getting the same out of you in terms of spending the time with you. But in the strict economic model that you're trying to apply toward the end, I'm struggling to see that, because I think in a market, you might, first of all, finding a price equilibrium is more of an aggregate issue. It's not
Right.
It's not for a particular individual. When I'm going to buy something at a market, I might vary the amount that I'm willing to pay for a particular good or service. I would vary it based on the quality. I would vary it based on how much I need that product and service at that time, but I'm applying a part of what I have in terms of money, usually a very small part for any particular good or service that I'm getting. Whereas in the experience of love or especially sharing your life with somebody, you're coming in with who you are entirely in the experience. It's all you are in terms of your values, your virtues, who you are as a person, how good a thinker you are, what your career is, how productive you are, all those sorts of things. So it's hard to see that as something that varies. Yes, to some extent you might be giving more on one day than another day in a sense of direct utility. But in terms of the actual characters and values that you're bringing in, that's not varying day to day, right? So help me see that part and how this applies.
That's a very good and tough question. I will give my best to answer that. So first, I would also, then maybe some small addendum here. I'm an Austrian economist. And according to the Austrian School of Economics, of course, you never have an equilibrium. We are always going toward the equilibrium, but there will never be a full state of equilibrium. That's the Misesian theory, which I would defend, but that will take another talk, But this is the point. We are never fully reaching that state of equilibrium where the price is fixed. The price is also varying all the time, at least slightly. And I think also as human beings, we vary over time. We change some of our values, some of our virtues, For instance, maybe you don't like golf today, but next week you start discovering, play it for the first time, so that becomes another value to you. So our value system also change over time, and so does the other. And so do the value systems of a seller and a buyer on the market. So they are pretty stable, but not completely stable. I think the same is true of love. So that would be the first point. And now I forgot the second point. Sorry, it was a very long question, but a very interesting one. If I come up with the solution, I will mention it, but now I forgot it. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah. You didn't have the second part? No, that was my whole point.
Yeah, very good.
Okay. Thank you, Martin. That was terrific. I have a question, though. Actually, two questions. One is about you presented the friendship and love as a continuum.
Yeah.
But there's one thing that seems qualitatively different, which is sexual attraction and sexual enjoyment and relationship, which I've never seen anything in Rand that specifically says why we are attracted to a particular sex and a particular kind of. She does talk about the sense of life that is embodied in a person's actions and speech and character, but it can be very concrete. Like when I was married, one of the things I loved about my wife was that she was fabulous at wrapping presents. It's not really a moral virtue per se, or most of us would be in the category of vice on that score. But, so it was just those tiny little things. Now, I could say the same thing about some of my friends because, I love their sense of humor. I love their productiveness. I love what they tell me about the world, et cetera. But it's not sexual. And so, a natural explanation is, well, there are hormones at work. There are early experiences that shape the particular kind of person that you find attractive, sexually attractive, and so on. So that's the first question. Does that introduce a qualitative distinction within this broader quantitative distinction?
I would say you express your love differently, and the more you get to the right side, to the red side of the scale, the more you would do, And this is why you already, if you compare, for instance, a statue with an animal, you're already doing more with the animal. You are, for instance, petting it, which you would not do with your statue. Then if you go one time further, then you are talking about friendship, a person, a human being, as against a cat. So you would also treat such a person differently because, of course, you can interact with that person. You can come up with ideas. You can plan together. But ultimately, if you end that very last stage, there is where you should feel sexual attraction and where you want to express that love, because romantic love in its expression, when we talk about sex, is something so special, I would say, that this should not be promiscuous. And this is why we should only express it when we are in that field.
Okay, I'm going to have to listen to the transcript or the reproduction. I didn't catch all that, and it sounded really heavy. So thank you. But the second question, if I can just squeeze this in, is in relationships among friends or lovers or marriages, a lot of, in my experience and from what I've read, a lot of the value comes not only from the attraction at a moment or at any given moment,
Right.
but we live through an extended arc of life. And when people are together for a long time, they are creating a kind of private universe where they alone inhabit, understand, and share. So that's always seemed like an important part of it, the temporal duration, the extended through time aspect, as well as the momentary, God, I'm hit by a thunderbolt seeing this person, and so on. So anyway, that's whether you thought that was an important part of the understanding of love.
I think that's very important. Thanks for mentioning that. Let me briefly comment on that. And I now remembered what I wanted to say to the other question, but let's tackle that first. You know, when you see people getting older and they have been married for a long time, there are in effect, I think, three types. So on the one hand, one of the parties or both parties might get bitter because maybe they didn't mirror in the first place, or they changed their attitudes. One of them is bitter, the other is not, and this is no longer working out because they are no longer compatible or they have never been compatible. The second option would be when you see people who are like 50 and they look the same. They are exactly, as you said, in their own universe. They are not dealing with anything anymore, and they are usually also terribly happy because they are not having any independent aims anymore, because they become like kind of one person separated in two. So they no longer have any individual goals. And the third ones are those which are still working out. And I think here you had the right matching in the beginning, and those people are still mirroring each other, and they still have the same values and virtues, and then it works. So I would think this is what we see in relationships over time. But now briefly to the other point, when we talk about the market, the point here I wanted to make is as follows. When we look at the market, it's not that we only buy one thing, as was pointed out by the questioner. We buy different stuff. But in the same way, we also love different stuff. And we also love not only one person, but we also love, as I said, events or attributes of people or pets or whatsoever. So in that sense, again, it's analogous to the market because we need to look at different things and how much time we give to different things in order to make our life the most worthwhile, because we do not pursue only one value, but we pursue different values and we love them. And in the same way, we do not only buy one product, but several ones.
All right, one last question.
Yes, thank you for this very, very thought-provoking talk. I'm thinking about the Hank Rearden quote, and in some ways, it's a beautiful quote, but in some ways, at the end of Atlas Shrugged, most of that stuff is gone. And I'm wondering what you make of the significance, and in a lot of ways, you talk about the longevity of the friendships, but in some ways, at least in that novel in particular, a lot of those things had to disappear for a while, so to speak. So I'm not going to use the word sacrifice, but a lot of the key characters, the friendships had to go so they could do what they had to do.
Yeah.
And even the work and some of the things they loved had to go. So.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. I will briefly answer it, but if you want to find more about that, what you should read or reread is the so-called conflicts of man's interest, which Rand has anthologized in The Virtue of Selfishness, because there she discusses that precisely. Okay. Now, the point is, in the end, of course, Dagny is together with John Galt, and they are having a relationship. But Rearden and Dagny still love each other in a different way, But the point is that, again, we can go back to that. The point is here that they are on a different level. They still love each other. They are no longer lovers. They are not expressing that love in that sense, in the sexual sense, but they still admire each other, certainly. They have a lot of respect for each other. They still trust each other. But the point is, we also need to look at this again. The point here is, is not that John Galt takes Dagny, and otherwise Dagny would have been happily ever after with Rearden. No, this is not the point. Because Rearden could have never gotten, and Rand says that in that article, by the way, I think. She says, Rearden could have never gotten what ultimately John Galt got, because Dagny and Rearden were never the perfect match. They were in a way cooperating very well. They had strong feelings for one another. They also had a purpose to find the destroyer, so they were working on that together, and that united them. But they never had the same kind of, I don't want to call it compassion, but the same kind of mutual feeling for one another, which Galt and Dagny have, on my view. This is how I read it. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Martin. Can we get a round of applause?
Thanks.